wondered if we could kick off by you telling me a little about the story you wanted to tell when you got this recording contract. Did you always have a clear idea of what direction you wanted to take?
Well, as soon as we started thinking about, what the story would be, I think the idea was very clear in my head, and it was a pretty immediate reaction from me. I quite honestly didn't think that we would sort of get the ball rolling with the debut album process as soon as I signed, but that's pretty much what happened. And at the time, I guess this was the end of the summer of last year, 2020. And here in the US, we were still very much in the thick of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we were seeing, a new story every day about a Black person who'd been killed at the hands of police. And I was trying to manage a lot of emotions. I was angry, I was sad, I was frustrated, I was confused. And I just couldn't help, I couldn't shake this thought that, like, I have to do something. What can I do? What can I possibly do to make any sort of a difference, or, so that we can sort of start to take more steps and bigger steps towards, a truly equitable and inclusive environment for everyone. And obviously my MO is music, classical music. And that field of all fields is probably the one that's, perhaps the most behind or at the bottom of the pack in terms of, really celebrating and promoting diversity and inclusion and accessibility and all these things that are very important in what we do. And this album for me, I very quickly realized that this is an incredible opportunity to share stories and experiences and voices of some really prolific composers who haven't found their way into the sort of traditional canon as we know it. And this is just a little slice, as far as I'm concerned, of what it is that we need to really bring our awareness to in terms of what composers have really made valuable contributions to this art form. We talk about American classical music, and we think about people like John Adams, Corigliano, John Williams, and things like this. But we don't really look at really the birthplace of American music itself, not just classical music, but I mean, it's all sort of trickled down, as far as I can see, from Black music and culture. Spirituals, jazz, blues. I mean, all of these things have found their ways into pretty much any style of pop music that we know. And this influence is something that I really wanted to highlight and sort of bring to people's attention. And that's actually why composers like Dvorak and Gershwin were included on the project, because these are composers that we know and love as classical composers, right? But we never sort of credit the people and the music and the voices that actually allowed them to create the music that they did and the music that we love. And then finally, I really just wanted to pay tribute, pay homage in some way to these artists who, in my mind, really have paved the way for myself and for other young artists like myself to do what we do freely and without fear in many cases. I look at a lot of the composers on this album, Florence Price, Grant Still, even Perkinson, who was alive later into the 20th century. And I always think about the fact that they had to navigate this world of classical music at a time where racism was completely normal. Nobody was batting an eye if Black people weren't allowed in, or if you couldn't go here, or if you couldn't do this. And I'm blessed that that's not my experience today, but I have someone to thank for that. And these are a few of those people. So that's sort of the general idea in so many words behind the album. And
growing up, how much did you have the opportunity to hear these composers live, or even on recordings, actually? Did you feel that there was quite a lot of digging to do before the music was even available there for you to perform?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't know that, it's funny to say, but I didn't actually know that the word composer meant anything other than like old dead white guy, pretty much, until I was 13 or 14. This was the first time that I became associated with the Sphinx organization. And suddenly I realized there's this whole other world that I was, not privy to. There were Black classical musicians that I did not know about. There were Black composers of classical music that I had no idea even existed. So that was my sort of first foray into some of the music of these composers. And I think it's just a testament to the fact that, and this applies to so many other professions outside of music, but it really is that the contributions, which in some cases are quite significant, of Black people have been historically diminished or forgotten or erased almost sometimes from history. And that's hurtful, you know, as a Black person who loves this art and who, you know, before I was 14 or 15, didn't even think about the fact that I was only playing music by people who I can't really relate to beyond like human emotions, right? I can't relate to the experience that they went through. I can't relate to what it is that they were, what it is that was inspiring their music. You know what I mean? And I think in this case, with these composers, obviously it's very different. You know, the Black experience here in the United States is obviously as widely varied as any human experience, but there are aspects of it that are shared through generations and throughout, you know, different communities on you know, either end of the country. And I think that is something that speaks to me really powerfully in this music. And I think it's something that it's a story and it's an experience that I want to share and that I want to sort of interpret myself and make available and accessible to as many people as I can. So to have the opportunity to do so in such a big and in such a special way with this album is really a blessing for me.
Thinking not just about composers, but also Black performers, who were the figures who inspired or even directly mentored you from that shared background?
Not many. Not many. I mean, again, when I was growing up, I didn't listen. I don't think I heard a single recording of a Black violinist or a music by a Black composer until I was a teenager, right? But at that point, you know, once I was introduced to Sphinx and, you know, I was sort of became a part of the Sphinx family, one of the first sort of mentors that I gained from that community was Sanford Allen, who's the dedicatee of Perkinson's Blues Forms, which appears on the album. He was the first Black violinist in the New York Philharmonic. He was part of the inaugural class of Young Concert Artists, which is a transitional management agency that I've been a part of for the past couple of years. And he actually worked with me on a movement of blues forms, which I ended up performing at Carnegie Hall for the Sphinx Virtuosi's annual tour. And you know, it was really eye-opening for me to learn about his experience in this field and to understand what he had to go through and the challenges he had to face and the sort of voices that he may have had to keep out of his head at you know, almost every turn, being the sort of token Black person almost anywhere he went. And you know, for me to know that it's because of his life and because of his efforts and his determination that I don't really have to experience that, or at least not to, you know, as extreme of a degree, was always incredibly inspiring for me. And I think the first time I heard this piece, it was his recording that he made of this piece, and it was honestly a little intimidating at first because I heard it and I was like, wow, this sounds incredibly difficult, but he's absolutely nailed it in this recording. So, you know, he has been, you know, one of my biggest inspirations in this regard. But yeah, it really wasn't until I was introduced to Sphinx that I felt a real sense of community in this regard, or at least as it pertains to Black musicians, Black composers.
I wondered if I could ask you a little about Xavier's piece, which opens the album, which I've been playing on loop pretty much for the past week or so. I absolutely love it. Tell me a little about your friendship and the genesis of the piece, really.
Absolutely. Well, Xavier and I are old friends by this point. I mentioned my first introduction to the Sphinx organization. That was in 2010 with their competition. And that's where I met Xavier. We were both competing in the junior division. And, you know, with it being a competition, although, you know, Sphinx really does a fantastic job of creating a sort of familial atmosphere, even among competitors. We didn't get to spend much time together because, you know, obviously we were both sort of focusing on competing. We were both focusing on the music and making sure we were, you know, as prepared as possible. But fortunately, the following year in 2011, we met again and had a, you know, a longer standing chance to hang out and get to know each other a little bit. And that was at the Perlman Music Program. It's Perlman's 7-week intensive summer music school for young string players under the ages of 18. And this is where Xavier and I kind of became friends. It's 2011, and the program takes place on Shelter Island, which is where the piece gets its name. Shelter Island is just on the very, very sort of tip of Long Island, New York. And as the name suggests, it's a sort of like paradise place for me. I mean, that's my second home by this point. I think I've been back to Shelter Island for the Perlman program every year since 2011, with the exception of last year. And though that was Xavier's only year at the Perlman Music Program, you know, we kept in touch, and I actually had several opportunities over the past several years to play his music. And he's written a double concerto for violin and double bass, which was performed with the Sphinx Virtuosi Chamber Orchestra. Didn't have a chance to play that. I've heard so many of his own compositions on double bass, and I've always been so captivated by obviously his incredible technique. I mean, I've never seen anyone play double bass like that, but also his voice, his artistic voice, and his compositional voice. I mean, it's so unique, and it's so satisfying for me. I think there's enough, like, you know, there's so much rhythm in the music. There's so much sort of funk in the harmonies, and it's always been something that I was drawn to. And when I had the chance to put this album together, and we were looking through history and finding all of these, you know, all of these possibilities for programming, you know, it wasn't long before we realized, okay, wow, yeah, we need to include someone who's alive. We need to include someone who's sort of, you know, the product almost of this lineage that we've been exploring. And Xavier was the first person who came to mind. So I asked him to write something. I didn't give him, you know, very much input, very much instruction, simply because I wanted this to be as organic and natural a representation of his voice as possible. I didn't want to put too many ideas into his head, besides the fact that I love everything that he's written. So, you know, he took that and he ran with it. And, you know, once he sent me the score of this piece, that is the score that we recorded off of. So there really weren't that many iterations of it. I mean, we were sort of on a time crunch from the beginning, with deadlines and all of that. But the piece is obviously inspired by our early days together on Shelter Island. And, you know, this piece has a sort of that sort of middle section where Xavier starts, the you know, the walking bass line is it's obviously just joyous music, but for me it always sparks a sense of sort of nostalgia for those younger days, those younger carefree days, you know, on this beautiful island, just making music day in and day out, and that's where the influence comes from. And you hear, you know, again, similarly to someone like Price, who takes influences from so many different places and puts them together so artfully in her music. Xavier takes influence from bluegrass music, solo bop, you know, popular music. I mean, it's all sort of wrapped up in this one thing, and there's so much, like, I think delicious is a good word, just interplay between violin and double bass, almost like we're really just talking to each other, reminiscing about those days. So it's a really, really cool piece. I think it's really different from anything else on the album, and I'm just so grateful that Xavier is willing to lend his voice to this project.